Good evening. Sadly, this has been a most tragic week for world Jewry. We have lost two giants of our people, Rav David Feinstein, noted posek and son of the late Rav Moshe Feinstein, and also Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the preeminent spokesman of world Jewry and champion of Judaism before her vociferous detractors around the world, both of whom were lions of Judah in their respective fields of rabbinics, and both of whom complemented each other. And interestingly, both passed away on the very same day. Indeed, this year has been one of great loss for our people, as we have lost rabbis and leaders from Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb to scores of lesser-known rabbis and community leaders due, sadly, to the scourge of COVID. I'm reminded of the words of Rav Ashi in Moed Katan, Im ba'arazim nafla shalhevet, ma ya'asu ezovei hakir. If the fire, the flame, has torched the tall cedars, what will the small brambles say or do? What can we do? How can we continue? Interestingly, this week's Parsha deals with this very issue. You see, at the end of Chayei Sarah, after the story of Abraham sending Eliezer to find a bride for his son Yitzchak, then the Parsha tells us that Abraham lived to a ripe old age of 175 years, and that both his sons attended his funeral. Now imagine for a moment, if you will, the scene. Not only for the family, but for the entire world. Avraham was a giant. He single-handedly defeated 4 powerful armies of evil and made the world safe from enslavement. He was the man who challenged God himself to save Sodom and Gomorrah. For every human life in his eyes was precious. And when God asked him to do the impossible for God's sake, to sacrifice his one and only prized son, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. Avraham did not hesitate. He rose first thing to fulfill the command of God. And now that giant, that world-renowned figure who influenced hundreds of thousands around the world to the belief of one God and the performance of morality and ethics, he was now gone. The void must have been too powerful to sustain. The Medrash tells us that at the funeral, Gedolei Umos Ha'olam, the leaders, the great leaders of the world, said, Oy lo la'olam, she'avad manhigo, woe to the world who has lost its leader. Oy lo lasfina, she'avad kabarnita, woe to the ship who has lost its captain. When the funeral was over and the Shiva concluded, the whole world and all those hundreds of thousands whose lives were changed forever by Abraham were forced to conclude that this is the end of an era. The age of giants was over. Vayivku, acharei mot Avraham. Abraham was gone. But what of Isaac? Doesn't he pick up the slack where Abraham left off? He was no simple, average person. He courageously was willing to sacrifice himself for God on Mount Moriah. And yet, we know very little about his life, save the suffering he experienced from his son Esav, and in his old age he became blind physically as well as spiritually from the hypocrisy of his son Esav. Abraham, on the other hand, was a dynamo, a powerhouse in world affairs. So perhaps the pasuk needs to inform us of this. Vayehi acharei mos Avram, after the passing of Abraham, Vayevarech Elohim et Yitzchak. God needed to give a special blessing to Isaac, as if to say, yes, the majesty of Abraham's legacy is temporarily in abeyance, but that legacy will never end. Isaac, you will continue to carry Judaism upon your shoulders, slowly, surely, perhaps without all of the fanfare and pomp that your father did. But in the end, your son Yaakov and continued grandsons Levi, Moshe, Aharon, they will even outshine the grandeur of Abraham. All this will come to pass, but only if you continue in your own quiet way, to the best of your ability, and stick to the principles which I have revealed to Abraham. And if God forbid you should fail in this, then the age of giants will have finished forever. Perhaps we can suggest that we too are at that historical stage yet again. We are not the only generation to have lost its giants, but if we look to our ancestors, we discover that they never gave up on the message that their leaders imparted to them. They succeeded in creating new generations of giants, and so it must be in every generation of Jews. The famous folklorist Maurice Samuel once compared life to a huge auction block. The auctioneer is time. The buyer is oblivion. Each human being goes to that block, and the auctioneer peals in a loud voice, "Going, going, gone." However, there is one people that have continually come to that same auction block, and when the auctioneer gets up, he shouts, "Going, going, going." He never recites that third word of gone. Our impact on life is an eternal one. Interestingly, the verse which we quoted before continues, God blessed Isaac, and Isaac returned to the well of Lachai Roi. The Targum translates this phrase, V'yitev Yitzchak smich lebeira de itgalei aloi yekar chai v'kayam dechamei v'lo itchamei, which means Isaac resided near the well, upon which God's majesty rests forever, from whence he sees, but is not seen. Isaac chose that derech, that path of Be'er Lachai Ro'i, of seeing very clearly, but of not being seen, of behaving quietly, perhaps exerting influence behind the scenes, behashket ubevitcha, as we say in Yiddish, stilleheit, quietly, yet firmly. We may perhaps be a generation of orphans, but the legacy of our giants lives and breathes in each and every one of us. And we will continue to see new giants in the future, new leaders, generation after generation, until the coming of that ultimate giant who we refer to as Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'mheira b'yameinu, v'nomar Amen.